Picture a Tuesday. Maybe it's last Tuesday. Maybe it's a Tuesday from when you were 7. It doesn't matter, so long as you can remember it fairly clearly. Got it? Okay. Now, with that Tuesday in mind, in each of our minds, let us begin from the moment we woke up and slowly walk ourselves through that day, paying special attention, as best as we can remember, to the people we encountered. In that way, we think through breakfast, and second breakfast, and 11sies, and lunch, and so on, and so forth, until finally, Wednesday. Now, chances are high that as we each took our strolls through that Tuesday past, we came across some familiar faces, people we might see no matter which Tuesday we chose, family members, colleagues, other karaoke night regulars. But chances are equally high that on that particular Tuesday, we ran across others as well. Perhaps we had a medical appointment that day, and so encountered a doctor, and nurses, and a receptionist, and other patients. Perhaps that was a day on which we enjoyed a fanciful drive down Route 1. And so encountered other fanciful drives. Perhaps we went to the bank, or to the store, or online, and had interactions with even more people. Some we know, and some we will never see again. The point is, friends, regardless of whether we choose a Tuesday, or a Wednesday, or any other day of the week, the same thing could be said. The truth is, each day of our lives is filled with encounters. Some with people we know, and some with people we do not. But as Christians, both kinds of encounters matter. You see, as Christians, we believe we have a fundamental connection to one another. A connection that exists no matter if we see that other person every day of our lives or never at all. After all, if we believe that we are all children of God, all of us, young and old, black and white, gay and straight, male and female, rich and poor, broken and whole, then we already recognize a connection. It's the connection that comes from being a part of the same family. And while we know from experience that it can be hard to be close to even members of your own family, in other words, while we know we might not be able to be close to every person we encounter, we also know that if we were to stop long enough to recognize each person as a child of God, then while our encounters might not be close, they just might be closer. And so today, and throughout this Lent, that will be our focus. Closer encounters. During these 40 days, friends, we will consider how we might have closer encounters with the other children of God on this third rock from the sun. The good news is that we won't walk this journey alone. Each week we will pause to consider a moment of encounter in the ministry of Jesus. Over the course of the next few weeks, we will watch as Jesus encounters authority figures, and foreigners, and consumers, and others. But before we get there, we have to get past our story today. You see, today we hear a story that reminds us that before we can achieve closer encounters with others, we first have to figure out how to be around ourselves. Today we hear a story of Jesus' personal struggle with temptation. Our passage today, from the very beginning of Mark's Gospel, begins with the baptism of Jesus. Now, if this sounds familiar, we should note that, strangely enough, this is the third time this particular passage has shown up in our lectionary in the last 2 months. It's as if the Ecumenical Council of Churches that put together the Revised Common Lectionary really wanted us to squeeze everything we could out of this baptism verse. Okay, we get it! Jesus was baptized by John in the Jordan River, and some freaky stuff went down. But since the third time's a charm, let's remind one another of some of that freakiness. Mark's Gospel begins with John the Baptist, dressed sort of funny, camel's hair, and shouting that someone would be coming who would baptize people with the Holy Spirit. But we barely have time to process that before, as if on cue, Jesus shows up and is immediately baptized. We don't know if he said anything or if he chose John for some particular reason. We're just told that he shows up, was baptized by John, and then when he was coming out of the water, the Spirit, like a dove, descends on him. And a voice says, "You are my Son, the Beloved. With you I am well pleased." Now, we aren't told that the voice was God's, but it seems a pretty fair guess, as Mark makes it clear that it came from heaven. What's more interesting, however, is that the announcement was directed right at Jesus. In Matthew, it's addressing the crowd. "This is my Son, the Beloved." But in Mark's Gospel, as in Luke's, it's directed right at Jesus. "You are my Son, the Beloved. With you I am well pleased." No pressure. As soon as the baptism is over in Mark, we're told that the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. Now, we could picture this as the Spirit actually grabbing Jesus and dragging him, kicking and screaming out into the wilderness, as if he didn't have much choice but to listen. And truth be told, some of us have probably experienced something similar. Moments in our lives in which it's clear what God is trying to tell us, and we just have to go along with it. But there is another way to view this passage. See, it could be that it was the pressure of that moment, the dove, the announcement from God, the expectations from John and others, the spirit of that place that drove Jesus into the wilderness. We know what that's like as well. We know what it's like to feel the pressure of expectation so acutely that we want to run as far away as possible. Maybe when Jesus heard the voice say, "You are my Son, the Beloved, with you I am well pleased," pointed directly at him, he was afraid to disappoint, and so he ran. He ran. Jesus ran into the wilderness, away from people, away from the pressure, to a deserted place. He found a space by himself and just stopped. For 40 days, he stopped. Now, we can read this 40 days bit in a lot of different ways. It's certainly reminiscent of Moses and Elijah and their moments of being in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. But we should also remember that 40 is one of those biblical numbers that means a long time. It's used in much the same way we would say it took 1,000,000 years to mean that our dentist appointment was weakness, as happens to so many of us in those moments of insecurity and doubt, Jesus was tempted. Now, it would be nice if Mark stopped there. Jesus was tempted, period. At a slightly more comfortable spot for modern readers. But for one reason or another, he didn't. No, Mark couldn't resist adding this other little bit that has caused Christians some serious challenges over the years. Mark says Jesus was tempted by Satan. Now, many of us try to avoid Satan, or devil talk, as much as we can, even though we know he tends to pop up quite a bit, sometimes in the details, and sometimes in a blue dress, or if not a blue dress, then definitely wearing Prada. The point is, we are uncomfortable talking about Satan. And frankly, who could blame us? Typically, people use the devil or Satan as a means of shirking responsibilities for their own action, for their own sinfulness. It's the classic, the devil made me do it, defense. But friends, even if we don't believe that there's a literal figure of personified evil who may or may not be wearing red spandex and carrying a pitchfork, there is something about this understanding that is helpful. The actual word for Satan is adversary. And it's the adversary that is tempting Jesus in this moment. And although we might not believe that it's a literal devil, we know that our biggest adversary, our biggest tempter, is often personified. Sure, sometimes in the form of another person, but if we're honest, more often our tempter comes in the shape of a person we encounter each time we look in the mirror. Friends, we believe in a God who gave us free will, choice to live in the world, which means that we are responsible for our own actions. We might choose to reach out to the other people we encounter on a daily basis in love, and we might not. In other words, while we can use lots of other people's views and thoughts and actions to justify our own, in the end we know that our biggest adversary is often ourselves. But the comforting news is that this seems to have been as true for Jesus as it is for us. Unlike his synoptic brothers, Matthew and Luke, Mark never tells us what Jesus was tempted by. We are left to imagine. Typically, this is not something we like. We are a culture that prefers to know what other people's temptations are. It's the reason we like The Bachelor. In this case, however, we are left to guess. Perhaps Jesus was tempted to just stop there, in the wilderness. After all, he'd been told by God that God was pleased with him, and then he ran out into the desert. Maybe he knew that the trouble with someone being pleased with us is that sooner or later we are bound to disappoint. Perhaps Jesus was afraid to go back because he thought he wasn't up for the task, that he wasn't who people thought he was, that the pressure was going to be too much. Perhaps Jesus was smart enough to recognize that the path ahead was not going to be an easy one, and so he was naturally and rightfully a little freaked out. We don't know. The truth is, there are any number of things that could have tempted him, and probably did. But the hopeful part for us, friends, is that in the end, he left the desert. In the end, Jesus overcame temptation, overcame his adversary. He left the desert, and because of that, so can we. He showed us the way. The text says that after John the Baptist had been arrested, Jesus went to Galilee and began to proclaim the good news of God. And it's here that we get how he did it. How he overcame temptations, his insecurities, himself. The good news of God. The irony is that it's the same news that sent him to the desert in the first place. You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. Jesus must have realized, finally, that there really was no pressure. That God wasn't pleased with Jesus because of what he had done. After all, at this point in Mark's Gospel, he had literally yet to do anything. No, he realized that God loved him no matter what he did. And it wasn't about what he did, but about who he was. He was a child of God. And because of that, God couldn't help but be pleased. You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. Do you see? In that moment, Jesus recognized grace. It was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. He recognized grace, the promise that God's love is not contingent upon anything that we do or don't do. It isn't contingent upon whether or not we're able to overcome our temptations. No, it is a gift freely given, and we have it whether we recognize it, whether we want it, whether we like it or not. Friends, grace is the reason that we remind one another over and over again, week after week, that we are all of us, children of God. Because inherent in that statement is a promise. A promise that our relationship with God is not contingent, but fundamental to who we are. And although the temptation is to play the adversary for ourselves, convincing ourselves that our worth is based on something else, the way we look, the money we have, the jobs we lack. The promise of grace is that our worth can be summed up by the same good news that Jesus heard on that day of his baptism. The same good news that God shouts every single moment of our existence. You are my child, beloved. With you I am well pleased. And friends, if we could start our days remembering that good news, then more than our Tuesday encounters,